So this evening, I'm really delighted to welcome Sara Blackburn to talk about gardening for wildlife, how to welcome frogs, hogs, and everything in between. Sara Blackburn delivered elements of the Yorkshire Tales of Amphibian Discovery project, which worked to encourage communities in amphibian conservation and deliver habitat improvements. Beginning her research career studying lions in Kenya, Sara's speciality is citizen science. She has worked on UK species, including hedgehogs, otters, and invasive species in waterways. So I'm going to hand you over now to Sara.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the introduction, Maria. Okay, as Maria said, I used to work for Froglife. I'm delivering this presentation on behalf of Froglife, and therefore there's going to be quite a large focus on reptiles and amphibians, and that's because they're often quite overlooked in terms of wildlife gardening techniques. There'll be plenty of questions for the end. Please, ask whatever you like for all sorts of species, and I'll do my best to answer them. So shall we get started? Shall I share my screen?
Yes, please.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, so we all kind of know what wildlife gardening is to some degree, and there's various different ways that we can implement wildlife gardening. And what I'm going to talk about today are the sort of gardening things that you can do, that you may be doing anyway, that you may be doing as part of the way that you manage your gardens, but just how you can do that with wildlife in mind. It's not about always making huge changes for wildlife or doing major tasks. There's lots of little different things you can do, small little changes that will help encourage a range of species to your garden. And it's important because wildlife across the UK, particularly in urban areas, is experiencing significant declines, and urbanisation and the development of urban areas and the reduction of habitat is one of the key reasons why we are losing wildlife species. So small changes and actions will benefit a wide range of species, and a key focus is on biodiversity as well, which is the number of species and the number of different taxa that we can support in one area. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is not just beneficial for wildlife, it's beneficial for us as well in terms of our mental well-being. I get a lot of enjoyment from my garden. It's a great area of refuge for me. It's somewhere to go and sit at the end of a busy day, and I can go and I can view all sorts of different wildlife species and enjoy the things that are growing there. And the great thing about wildlife gardening is that you can tailor it to your gardening needs. So you don't have to have a huge expanse of green space. There's lots of different things that you can do regardless of how much space you have, and also what you use your garden for, if you use it for recreation or if you use it, for example, for planting vegetables. And gardens are really, really important for biodiversity in urban areas. They have a high biodiversity potential, and that's mostly because we can plant a wide range of flora, a diverse range of flora, both native and non-native species, and we can have a diverse range of habitats in a really small space. You can have everything from a small lawn to overgrown grass areas to log piles, ponds, etc. And these are all the sorts of things I'm going to talk about today. And they also provide things that are limiting to species. So habitats and resources may prevent a population of a certain species from expanding because it isn't available. So by providing those different resources, that may be food, that may be somewhere to breed, that will help that species be present in an area. And it's important as well to think about the value that gardens have for non-native species, and as I'll mention in a bit, non-native plant species can be beneficial as well, and that's something that's a good thing to have in gardens instead of releasing something that may become an invasive species in the wild. So the main value of a garden is an area of refuge in an urban area. It's somewhere for wildlife species to feed, to shelter, and to breed. But gardens also connect habitats. So we may have in an urban area, I live in Sheffield, for example, we have some great parks and green spaces, but they are, you know, really separated from each other by roads, by buildings, and by having valuable wildlife gardens that can help connect these areas that will allow a species to gain everything that it needs. Some gardens are also quite long established, which means that there may be things like mature trees that can provide value to a range of species. So gardens are really something that we need to big up in our urban environments. So I'm going to go through this presentation in sort of a seasonal way, because I think as we all know, our gardens change significantly through the seasons, and what we can do and what we may want to do and the different species that we may want to attract will differ across the year. And again, I'm just going to remind you that I'm going to focus on lots of different species here, but there is going to be a focus on reptiles and amphibians. And for that reason, I'm going to say that one of the best things that you can do in your garden is to build a pond. So a pond is going to provide a habitat to various different reptiles and amphibians, but also it's going to provide a habitat to different invertebrates that may be a food source for lots of different species that you have in your garden. And it's also going to provide water. And the presence of a pond, you know, we have all experienced the really hot weather that we've had, can make the difference of life or death to a frog that is trying to get, a damp area. Amphibians rely on damp areas to survive. So a pond is not all created equal. So I'm going to just go over a few tips and tricks to create a really good pond for wildlife. I've got 4 illustrations here of what makes a good pond and what makes a bad pond, indicated by the green ticks and the crosses. And one of the most important things is that wildlife can get in and out of your pond. There's no point having something like a bucket. We can use bucket as a pond, but if wildlife can't get in and it can't get out as well, then it's actually going to be, could be a dangerous thing to certain species. So a great way to do this is to do a gravel little shale bank, or put some rocks in your pond. These top 2 examples give some good demonstrations here of how we can do that. And in the top right as well, you can see some rather adorable little steps leading out of the pond, which may be a lifesaver for something like a hedgehog, which may fall in. So that's a really important element of your pond. And that also provides a shallow gradient. So different species will live at different depths within your pond, different invertebrates. You may have things like caddisfly living quite deep. You may have Daphnia and things where they need to be quite warm. So different temperatures are present at different depths of the water. And also that provides different light levels for different plants that may be living in your pond. So that's a really good additional benefit to having a shallow gradient into your pond. Some shade is really important as well. Now, light, sunlight does provide, that important resource for plants, but shade makes sure that areas don't become overheated, and make sure that things like amphibians, which, need to be careful of their water, moisture levels, don't dry out. And putting it in shade as well means that it's more able to keep a stable water level. And ponds in the wild, in our natural habitats, will have fluctuating water levels, but probably not to the extent that an exposed pond may be allowed to dry out. So you can top up your pond, you can just use tap water, but what we recommend is that you use a conditioning chemical that you can buy from a garden centre, and then that will remove the chlorine, because chlorine can be harmful for some wildlife. The other thing to do would be to have a rainwater butt, maybe to a gutter or something like that you can use to top up your pond. It's also really important to think about the different plants that we're going to have in there, and that's going to provide oxygen to allow a different range of species to survive. So there's lots of different oxygenating plants, different pond weeds. What I'm going to do is at the end of this, through that email that Maria mentioned, is provide you with some resources from Froglife that will suggest different plants. I'm not going to go into all of the different ones now. So just bear that in mind. You will, receive a resource that will help you choose the right plants to have in your pond. A vegetated margin is also really important as well. And this pond in the bottom left corner shows a really good example of a vegetated margin. And what you want is different plants of different heights, some really dense areas, and that will allow species to seek refuge from predators and from sunlight as well. But it's really important that vegetated margin is there also to make sure that if you have a pond liner for your pond, it isn't exposed. And this is a really dangerous thing for amphibians. If a frog goes and sits on there, it's going to bake essentially. So exposed liner gets so hot, and it's really important that is covered up from the sun. So on the bottom here we have a good pond and a bad pond. The good pond follows all of these different things. The bad pond, you're not going to have very much living in there. It still can provide a drinking resource for things like birds, but it's not really going to support a long-term biodiverse, range of species. I will say that if you're going to be building a pond, don't worry if things aren't moving in straight away, if you don't get frogs the first year. Ponds take about 3 years to reach the point where they're getting mature and the sort of everything's sort of settling down, the plants are becoming established, and that the sort of chemicals in the water are all becoming stable. So you need to be a little bit patient with a pond if you want it as a really valuable wildlife resource. But the other thing that we can do in spring and summer is to think about what we're growing. And one of the great things that you can do is plant a variety of different flora to help wildlife in different ways. And you can do this by having a wild patch. You don't need loads of space. You can have pots and planters, and you can think about the different resources that these different species will provide to the wildlife that we want to attract. And of course, flora diversity is a valuable thing in itself as well. We actually, in Sheffield, there's been a great ongoing project called Sheffield Bugs, which has looked at the biodiversity of urban gardens, and that found that gardens had twice as many taxa as sort of derelict urban areas, and they had sort of a third of those species were natives that had self pollinated and integrated themselves into that garden. So they're a really valuable resource for different floral species. Some tips here. You want to think about including some native pollinators, and there's all sorts of different ways that you can get wildflowers into your garden. I actually sometimes just go to the pound shop and they have a variety of plants. Loads will be native, some will be non-native, and they will bring all sorts of colour and various different benefits to wildlife in terms of pollinating insects. So just a standard wildflower mix will bring some of the species that you're wanting to have in your garden for pollinators. One of my favourites is cornflower. They have loads of different blooms and they're really good for things like bees and butterflies. Borage is a really good one as well. That's really prolific, and that can be quite beneficial as well if you grow vegetables. Perennials can return every year, so think about things like foxgloves. A lot of our native species, our native plant species, are really good for our native insects because they have evolved at the same time. So they are basically designed to attract the sort of insects that we want to bring to our gardens, things like bees and hoverflies, for example. It's also important to think about year-round flowering, and for that reason it's important to think about including some non-native species as well. So things like verbena is a fantastic plant that will flower really late on, and that will provide pollen for insects into the autumn. Spring flowering bulbs on the other side as well will provide food for things like queen bees that come out really early. So it's about thinking about what you can provide for all insects and lots of different wildlife throughout the year. If you really like growing vegetables, which I do, you can plant lots of different things to draw pests away from your plants. Mint is really good if you have issues with black fly and things like tomatoes and broccoli. Garlic chives are really good for things like carrots. I have an alarming amount of black aphids in my garden. I mean, it looks horrendous, but they are all on my nasturtiums. So I've planted nasturtiums specifically alongside my beans. I have no aphids on my beans, and they're all on the nasturtiums, and it's worked really well. So they also provide, they're fantastic blooms, and they spread really well, and they're a good source of pollen as well. You can also think about planting things or incorporating things that aren't just your standard flower. So things like hedgerows, if you have a hedge in your garden, think about the different native species, things like blackthorn. They will provide pollen to insects early on, and they'll provide fruit later on. You can have a shrub in your border as well, at the back of your border. Flowering trees also provide a huge amount of pollen for insects, and things like sunflowers as well. I'd love to show you my garden right now. I have an amazing sunflower. In fact, I've got about 8 sunflowers. I live in a terrace house in Sheffield, so my garden is tiny, but I actually can't really get in my garden because of my sunflowers, which have self-seeded from one sunflower that I grew last year, but there's about 40 blooms on one of them, and it's because it's gone in my wood chip. So highly recommend, if you like growing sunflowers, put it in some wood chip. So that's had so many bees and hoverflies and everything around it, so that's been fantastic. And then of course, obviously later on, you can dry your sunflower heads and they'll provide seeds for birds in the autumn. Another way that you can have different plants in your garden is to think about having some messy borders. So you can chuck some wildflowers in with your border, and this is what I've done. It doesn't require any maintenance, or you can just let some grass grow wild. You know, try not to have it too manicured, and that will provide a range of refugia and food for different wildlife species. You can also incorporate no-mow areas, and this is something that I've done in my parents' house. I don't have a lawn here, but if you just leave a little area unmown, you'll be amazed by what comes up. You'll get different vetches, you'll get clovers, you'll get some really nice grasses that come up, and it can look really, really pretty. And you can supplement that with wildflowers, although I will say that grass does inhibit a lot of wildflowers, so you may need to think about, oh, I can't remember the name. I'm going to have to come back to you with the name. It's the yellow plant. Bear with me on that one. There's one plant that you need to plant which parasitizes on grass and helps your wildflowers grow. So some tips here. Think about long grass. So particularly for amphibians, this is really good. It provides a cool, damp area and somewhere to hide, particularly if you have spawning frogs and toads in your garden. For the little froglets and toadlets, they will go straight into your lawn and they will look for areas of long grass to hide and to stay cool. So try not to sort of tread on these areas. Again, like I said, you can add wildflowers to these, and those wildflowers can also work as a cut flower patch. I bring in my wildflowers every year. Things like cosmos and cornflower make really nice cut flowers. They don't last you know, for ages, but you know, there's plenty of them coming that you can always replenish. Think about a variety of heights. So you'll have different insects feeding at different heights, hoverflies feeding at different levels for bees. You'll have things like beetles that also want to feed on the flowers as well. Something I'd like to mention, particularly if you've got long grass, is to be really careful about strimming or mowing your lawn. If you are attracting wildlife and you're successful in attracting wildlife, then you may have things like hedgehogs in your long grass. So at my parents' house, there is a border that we have that every year there is a patch of long grass and we have a hedgehog hibernating in it every year, which is adorable. But we wouldn't want to trim that area. So if you give it a little bit of a ruffle, you should be able to move on the wildlife that's there. And again, that pond border that I mentioned earlier that is really important for amphibians to hide in is a great place to have your long grass if you don't have any other areas available. The other thing to think about is if you are into growing flowers or vegetables, to think about natural pest control. I am not going to tell you to absolutely never use slug pellets, because for some of us, it is a losing battle against slugs. But please think about this, you know, if you can think of other alternatives, or at least wildlife friendly slug pellets, that's really important. I've done some extensive research and trials and error on the best way to eliminate slugs and snails from my garden. I have various courgettes, which unfortunately have been completely demolished by slugs, but my beans aren't doing too bad. They did survive and are now, you know, pretty tall. But I've tried various different things to keep off the slugs and snails. I would say that the best thing that you can do is your good old-fashioned slug hunt at night. Now it's going to be at what, like 10 o'clock or something. Go outside with a head torch, preferably after it's rained, and with a little bucket, pick them up and take them for a long drive in the country. And that is one of the best ways that you are going to get rid of your slug and snail problem. What you can do to make your life a little bit easier is you can put down boards or a wet plant saucer, and that will attract the slugs and snails under there during the daytime, and then you can go and pick them off at your leisure. Bramble is something that I have tried and has been relatively successful. Here's a demonstration. I mean, this snail probably crawled straight over the bramble after this photo was taken, but let's just pretend that it actually stayed in the bramble. It has been relatively successful. Go for those really spiky long ones. They just don't want to crawl over anything that's spiky. And you can use as well diatomaceous earth. So this is in the top right. That is somewhat successful. It has to stay dry. It's not successful when it's wet. And also what this does is break down, it's sort of an irritant to the foot of the slug and snail, but it is also really damaging to other insects. So try not to use it where there's things like bees, for example. It will destroy their exoskeleton and kill them. Beer traps are something that's recommended. I am not going to recommend beer traps. What they do is they smell glorious to the slugs and snails, and they will come into your garden, but maybe only 10% are going to fall into your beer trap, and the rest of them are just going to feed on your plants, etc. So it may look like they're working, but for every one slug in there, you've probably got 10 that you've brought in. Your neighbours will like you, but not recommended. And slug pellets, again, various different ones are being phased out, the ones that are very damaging. Ferrous phosphate based slug pellets are the ones to go for if you do have to use slug pellets. These are available from garden centres. They're certified by the LNHS and RSPB. There have been limited studies done, so we don't know how damaging they are to wildlife. So again, this advice is taken with a pinch of salt, but if you absolutely must use slug pellets, if you're fighting a losing battle, try and corner the area off so things like hedgehogs can't go in there, and use them very sparingly, and use ones that are based on ferrous phosphate. You can also think about attracting natural predators. So amphibians will feed on slugs and snails. It's a bit of a myth that hedgehogs feed a lot on slugs and snails. They primarily feed on earthworms and beetles and various other random things. Birds, though, are very good. And, you know, if you've had a very satisfying, I sound terrible. I should love all wildlife, but I have had a long bitter battle with slugs and snails. But if you've seen a thrush, you know, feeding, you know, smashing open a snail to feed, you know, attracting different birds to your garden will help with that pest control. So the companion planting, I've mentioned those marigolds, which I have had huge success with. Sage is also very good for brassicas. Sorry, the nasturtiums I mentioned, but I've also had success with marigolds as well. So these will all draw your aphids, etc., off your prize vegetables. So they're really worth looking into, and they look great as well. When we come into spring and summer, there's also going to be things growing. We're going to be wanting to prune our hedges. So firstly, I mentioned the different, you know, planting hedges. That's a really beneficial thing to do for wildlife. Think about brambles, keeping some of those. If you've got an allotment, you know, try and keep some of the brambles in there, and then you can have some blackberries available, which are fantastic. It's really important to think about bird nesting season for the majority of the spring and summer. I think we're out of bird nesting season now at the 1st of September, but it is basically against the law to disturb nesting birds. So it's really important that before you prune your hedges or trees, you have a look and see if there are any nesting birds there. And you need to do this check on the day. And if there is something nesting there, you do need to leave it until they fledge. So keep an eye on it. It's not the end of the world. It's definitely worth leaving it for the possibility of killing off a nest of birds or disturbing them so they get abandoned. When we come into autumn and winter, we want to be thinking about providing resources, things like homes and things like food for species that may struggle throughout the autumn. So there's lots of different things that we can do here. You can build a hedgehog house. You can buy these. It's basically just have an upturned box or something that hedgehogs can go and live in. Try and put things like straw in there. We had at my parents' house a hedgehog living in an old hen house, which is rather nice. A bug hotel is also something that's really beneficial. So the Sheffield Bugs project showed that for solitary bees and wasps, a bug hotel is really good. So for this, you want to be including things like bamboo, and you want to be including holes that are about 4 millimeters in size was the most beneficial thing. Log piles and hibernaculums are one of the best things for reptiles and amphibians to last them through the autumn and winter. It sounds like a complicated thing, but it is essentially a pile of logs either buried under the ground or stacked on top and covered with vegetation and soil to make it cool and damp and of a sort of a similar temperature throughout the year. So you can put these in a well-draining, shaded area, pile up stones and logs, just bury these or pile them up, cover them with soil or turf. You can plant some wildflowers on top if you like, but make sure you leave some small access holes. You can put some drain pipe in there as well, and that will provide somewhere to go in. And these are sorts of things that we created as part of the Yorkshire Toad project, and we've had some reports already that they're being used, so they're a really good thing to include. A log pile as well is something fantastic to do. It's really easy. These can attract all sorts of insects and vertebrates. You'll get everything living in there, from your slugs and snails but there are lots of slugs that actually are beneficial as well, that don't actually feed on your plants. So they are a wildlife species to attract. You'll also get different fungi as well, which will significantly increase the biodiversity value of your garden. Put these in a shady area and make sure they're undisturbed. If they are freshly cut, they'll take quite a long time to decompose. So things like your wood lice and your detritivores may take a while to use them, but they will provide that refugia for a wide range of invertebrates. I mentioned those solitary bee homes. This is an absolutely epic one made out of pallets. You don't need to go that far. Again, the most beneficial thing to include are those hollow bamboo stems, and you can get a log or a block of wood or something and drill some holes in that are about 4 to 6 millimeters in diameter, and they'll be used by lots of different things, and including I'm not going to be able to say that word. Parasitic wasps. There we go. Got there eventually. And they are, quite a rare species. Lots of species that are quite rare in different areas in Sheffield, for example, and that's a really important refugia for them. On the refugia, you can include an upturned plant pot. These can be used as bumblebees for bumblebee nests if you put them in a warm area. But they'll also, if they're in a damp area and a cool area, they'll provide refugia for reptiles and amphibians. Metal sheets as well can be really good for attracting things like lizards, and piles of undisturbed bricks as well are also fantastic. I used to live on a little island in Northwich, and I had a big pile of bricks that I had to move one day, and it was quite a damp area because I was surrounded by the canal and the river, and I counted 42 newts in this pile of bricks, which of course, being a wildlife lover, I then had to return the bricks and return the newts, so I couldn't actually use the bricks, but there you go. So if you like newts, bricks, fantastic. The other thing we can think about are compost heaps. These are a great thing to have in your garden, but please don't have the sort of sealed bins that you can buy. These are not really a good wildlife resource. They can't get in and they can't get out. So, they're not really going to provide the sort of thing that a compost heap provides, which is habitat. It's a warm habitat for different reptiles, and then also cool, damp areas for different amphibians. You can make these out of anything. I think the humble pallet is a fantastic resource that you can use. They're often free. Stack them up like you can see in the bottom left corner here, and they're really good because they keep everything in, they allow airflow, and they allow gaps for things to get in and out. If you don't have a compost heap or don't want a compost heap, something like a leaf pile or a grass pile is really good as well. And if you're lucky and you live in certain areas of the UK, you may get things like grass snakes living there as well. Again, make sure they're undisturbed. You may want to cover your compost heap to keep the heat in. Use something like an old carpet or tarpaulin. If you are having a compost heap on an allotment, just check whether you can use carpet and tarpaulins, because sometimes they're banned. And again, metal sheeting is a good thing to use as well. We also want to think about other species. So boxes and bird boxes are a great thing to incorporate into your garden if you have the room. Bird boxes, I've put this into autumn and winter because it's really important that at the end of every year, you have a check and see that make sure that they're actually still viable. So you may get things like an unsuccessful brood still being in there, which needs cleaning out. And they're also used by wasps as well for nests. So if you want them to be used in the spring, they need to be nice and clean and you know, accessible. Make sure there's no rotting bits, you know, the bottom's not going to fall out of them and things like that. So just maintain them a little bit. Bat boxes as well are things that you can buy and put on your house to attract bats. That's a great thing to do. The other thing that we're going to be doing in autumn and winter is repairing bits of our garden. I mentioned the bricks earlier. We may have flags that need to be maintained. You may have a patio that you want to take up. Things like different lizards and newts will go and live under these areas. So just be really careful that they don't actually hibernate. They kind of more go into a bit of a dormancy. So if you do find a frog or a toad or a newt sort of in what you think is hibernation under a flagstone, then you can just move it and put it somewhere else quite similar. It needs to be cool and damp. Basically think about where it's come from and try and find something with the same sort of conditions. A lot of us as well live in areas where we may have fences, especially if you're in a new build. You know, you have fences all around, which, you know, can stop wildlife getting in and out of your garden. There's no point doing all of this great stuff for wildlife unless wildlife can get in and out. So a fence gap is essential. For a frog or a toad, it only needs to be about 5 centimetres. For a hedgehog, it needs to be about 15 centimetres, and that's about the size of a CD. There's a great website called Hedgehog Street where you can map your hedgehog hole, and they are looking at various different mapping research to help plot the distribution of hedgehogs and look at how they move throughout the landscape. Hedgehogs actually sort of really like linear features, so they'll walk along a fence until they find a hole and go through. Toads, you might need to have a few different gaps there. Feeding the birds is also something that can be really beneficial. Again, the gardens provide those limiting resources that may not be found in other habitats. Just be careful about what you do feed the birds. Bread is not good. The best thing to do is in winter, birds are looking to kind of fatten up and to survive. So things like suet and high fat seeds like sunflowers are really good. So that will help them fatten up, provide a lot of calories. If you're feeding birds in the spring, it's actually better to think about things like mealworms and fruit and things that are better to feed young birds. Suet is not the best thing for newly hatched chicks. The last thing to mention is citizen science. It's a real passion of mine. I think, you know, it's all very good having one researcher, you know, traipsing around doing a load of work, but the real value in wildlife research, I think, is getting a lot of data from a lot of people. And there's loads of different projects that you can take part in. You know, there's the Garden Bird Watch, there's Big Butterfly Count, there's loads of different things run by lots of different organisations like the RSPB. I really encourage you to take part. It's great for things like for kids and for learning about different species. You're often provided with lots of resources to identify these species. And Froglife has their own app as well called Dragon Finder, which can help you take part in citizen science. So we're looking for people to identify and record the reptiles and amphibians that they see in their garden, and also use it to report any cases of wildlife disease as well. This app can be downloaded for iPhone and for Android. It will help you identify and report different species. And I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the species that you may see in your garden. Most common thing you're likely to see are frogs and toads. And you can tell the difference between these by mostly looking at the skin, but also sort of the forms of the legs. Toads are quite dumpy, they're warty, they're quite dark in colour, and they tend to sort of hobble around and waddle. They don't really jump. If you see something leaping around, it's more likely to be a frog. They've got really nice mottled green skin, and they're more likely to be in a pond. Toads tend to use a pond mainly just for breeding, but a frog will kind of like hang around there quite a lot during the rest of the year. If you're really lucky, you may have smooth newts and common lizards. These have different habitats, so newts tend to really like ponds, but then they'll also go in nice dark areas like a pile of bricks. They are really spotty, they've got really smooth skin. There's different species. Your common smooth newt is what you're most likely to see. I think they're really lovely things to have in a pond. A common lizard is something that you'd be really lucky to attract as well. I've never seen one in my garden, unfortunately. They really like warm areas. They're easier to identify than, from newts by having the scaly skin. They're also really fast. If you see something sort of lizard shaped scuttling around, it's more likely to be a lizard than a newt. Newts are pretty slow. So if you do find a common lizard, please report it to Froglife. If you're super lucky, you may see a slow worm or grass snake. And I've been lucky enough to see slow worms out in the Peak District, where they'll be sunbathing on like peat paths and things like that. Grass snakes, you may get in piles of grass. They're not called grass snakes for no reason. And they are quite possible to attract to your garden. And I think these are really interesting species to have around. You're doing a good job if you are attracting these sorts of species to your garden. And again, please report these to Froglife. So I'm going to open this up to questions in a few minutes, but just to cover some of the key ones. A lot of people think that attracting wildlife to their garden is going to cause havoc. They're going to have this huge, messy garden, and it's going to look terrible, and it's going to have like foxes running around everywhere. That's not the case. Wildlife, the sort of wildlife that I've talked about attracting to your garden, is actually going to help you with your pest control and help you with things like attracting really interesting species to watch, and that will again bring you those mental health benefits, and also be a great thing for things like children to watch as well. So wildlife is really beneficial to have around. Again, I've mentioned lots of different things that you can do, and the emphasis is that it doesn't matter how many things you do. You can do one tiny thing, or you can go completely mad. But a lot of these things are just one-off jobs. You don't have to spend a lot of time. Just chuck some wildflower seeds, or even don't mow a bit of your lawn. It'll actually save you some time. And you can incorporate it into things like family activities, build a pond, and then you can spend the day, identifying different species that you'll see. Go take your children on a bug hunt, look at the different resources for citizen science activities, and go and spend the day doing that. There's some great ways that you can incorporate wildlife gardening without actually having to spend ages in your garden digging up a load of soil. You don't need loads of space as well. So I've got a super tiny garden. I mean, it is primarily taken over by this huge sunflower, but you can put things in hangers. Companion planting, things like your nasturtiums, can go between your plants. You don't need extra space, and you can have a really tiny pond as well. It will still attract some wildlife. My neighbour has got a Belfast sink with some water in it, and it looks really a bit manky. It doesn't really maintain it. It's got a couple of plants in there, but she has frogs coming and sitting in there. So it's great. It's a tiny little thing. And again, your garden doesn't have to be messy. I think wildflowers in a pot look really, really nice. So you can just have an allocated corner. If there's an area that isn't really very good for growing things, it's a bit shaded, why not put a log pile there? You can even make your log pile look neat. You can just have a small area of your garden given over to wildlife, and the amount of species that you will attract will be significant. Just to summarize, gardens are really valuable spaces for wildlife. A lot of wildlife is in decline, but it's not too late if we focus on making our gardens viable for different wildlife species, to connect different habitats and provide those limiting resources. And you can make a difference. Every person that builds a pond or plants some wildflowers, we have lots of people doing that in a city, then we're providing a huge resource to wildlife. And there are many resources available. Again, I'm going to send you some resources after this in the email, and there's plenty of there's loads of books available. I'm sure there will be some in the library. There's different websites. Just Google wildlife gardening and you'll get all sorts of tips from lots of different resources. Okay, so that's it for the presentation. I'll hand over now for any questions, and we'll go from there. I will stop sharing my screen. I think there we go. Hurrah!
Hi, thank you ever so much for that, Sarah. It was really very helpful because it was full of very practical tips that people could kind of think straight away what were they, you know, what they could use those in their garden or whatever sort of outside space they have. So it was that was really helpful, I think. I like the way you kind of went through the top tips for the pond and then top tips for planting. Really kind of useful, and people were kind of really engaged. We've had over 200 people listening, which has been fantastic.
Fantastic.
And I did notice in the chat, before we go on to the questions, there was quite a lot of reservations about slug pellets.
Yeah.
And also understanding that not all slugs are problematic. So exactly. I don't know if you want to just say a little bit more about that, and then we'll kind of go on to pick up some questions.
Yeah, the reason why I mentioned slug pellets is because people have asked about them, and when I've given this presentation in the past, people have said, I'm just going to use slug pellets. So the reason why I mention them is because there are bad slug pellets, there are really bad slug pellets, and there are slug pellets that are pet safe, and if you are going to use slug pellets, they are the ones to use. So that's why I wanted to mention the ones with ferrous phosphate in. But please try and focus on the other, you know, pest control things that I've talked about, things like brambles, etc. But you know, I've been delivering presentations to allotment holders, and they are a very tough crowd in terms of pest control. They'll just, you know, you know, when you're battling a huge slug problem, they will just use slug pellets. So that's why I wanted to mention that. And yes, there are many different types of slugs. I'm not a slug expert, but I do know that there are different predatory slugs. I don't know which one's coming to my kitchen, but I don't know what they're feeding on, but there's those ones as well. So there we go. So yeah, not all slugs are bad. I mean, I'm a bit sad about my courgettes. Let's
yeah, and it's not easy, is it, when you're gardening, you know, nurtured something, and then it's like, but anyway, the slugs have enjoyed it, and it's kind of helped them.
Absolutely.
From that point of view. Okay, I'm going to ask Anka now to pick up a couple of questions from the chat. Okay, so over to you, Anka.
Hi. Okay. Yeah, there were a few, and there are now more and more coming in, and actually quite a few complimentary comments as well about the talk. So OJ was wondering. He said, you know, but ponds get dirty in you know, really little time, and get smelly around the house. Is there a way to avoid that?
Sure. So I mentioned putting your pond in a shaded area, but what you really need to do is sort of and I should have mentioned this in the pond building bit, try not to put it under a tree, because one of the main things that makes it smelly is things like leaf litter. So that's sort of the preventative method is your best thing. They also get smelly when there's not enough oxygen in there as well. So having a range of oxygenating plants will help keep the water clear. But it is important to clear out a pond. That buildup of detritus in there, your rotting leaves, for example, can prevent things like dragonflies and damselflies from you know, their larvae from living in there where they want sort of silty areas. So what you can do is you can clean out your pond once a year or every couple of years, and it's best to do this in autumn or winter when things are dormant. So you can drain the pond, or you can use a net to scoop out some of the leaf litter. You can also take out some of the silt, but try and keep that separate, because you will have beetles and things like that, different invertebrates that have laid eggs, that have a life cycle that takes multiple years, that are living in the sediment. So try and keep your sediment separate. Take out your leaf litter and just leave that at the edge of the pond. And if it's at the edge of the pond, then things will go and crawl back in. You'll and hopefully just have a little sort through it. If you see anything, just chuck it back in, and then that can be disposed of in your compost heap. So I do think, you know, raking out the leaves is really beneficial, and that should be a way of keeping it clean. Some ponds just just do go a bit stagnant, and that's usually, again, if there isn't any sunlight in there, and there's no oxygen, you know, the plants aren't doing very well, they can get really quite stagnant. So just, yeah, you might want to think about maybe extending your pond a little bit. You may want to think about clearing out a bit of area to try and get a bit of sunlight through to it, but keeping a bit of that shade as well.
Thanks. There were also some questions about compost bins. So one person was asking, can you use layers of old cotton sheeting to cover your compost bin? And then somebody else was concerned about covering the compost bin in metal because it might be a fire hazard in hot temperatures.
I haven't seen it being a fire hazard, but if that is a concern, then there are many different things you can use instead. So if that is a concern, something like an old carpet or a tarp is absolutely fine. I think a cotton sheet will be fine as well. I mean, what you're trying to do is you're trying to, because it's decomposing, you're trying to sort of keep a bit of that heat in and try and, I think I'm not a compost expert, I do apologise, I may be getting this wrong. I'm pretty sure there's a buildup of carbon dioxide and that helps with the decomposition process. So it's kind of like maintaining its little like mini ecosystem in there. So covering it keeps the moisture in, keeps the heat in. I'm pretty sure cotton sheets would work, but you know, again, my parents, they have a great garden, which is why I keep talking about it. They've got just an open compost heap and they just chuck all of the stuff on there and there's loads of stuff living in there. And they turn it as well. I know people worry about turning a compost heap for disturbing wildlife. If you do it carefully and don't just like ram a fork in and just, you know, go for it, then things like toads and everything they'll just redistribute themselves. You know, wildlife can be quite hardy. So yes.
And here's a slightly different question. Somebody, Laura was asking about the rabbits in her garden. She has rabbits there. I'm assuming they're pet rabbits rather than wild ones, but she's wondering if they will frighten off the amphibians.
I don't think so. I mean, chickens, I would say that chickens, I thought chickens were just wonderful creatures, just wonderful, darling creatures. But no, I had chickens and they actively hunted the frogs when I lived on a little island. So I would say chickens are bad. I don't think rabbits would frighten anything off. You know, amphibians and reptiles, they spend quite a lot of their time hiding and they kind of know how to evade things. You know, rabbits will not eat or predate amphibians and reptiles, so you should be fine. Cats are known to catch frogs and things just because they move. So I would say that your rabbits are fine. If you have cats and you have chickens, they're the ones to look out for. Yeah, I really wouldn't worry. I think it's fine.
I mean, Laura has actually commented that they are wild rabbits.
Oh.
I have a pet rabbit and she chases the cat. So
fantastic.
I wouldn't trust her around frogs, to be honest, but
yeah, but then she's got to catch it, hasn't she? You know, and do something with it. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure I absolutely would not want to limit your rabbit to not enjoy your garden and by chasing off wild rabbits as well. I'm pretty sure the frogs will cope.
I'd love to have wild rabbits in mine, I tell you.
Yeah.
And there's Jill was asking, I feed badgers on sunflower hearts, chicken dog biscuits, and peanuts. The hedgehogs feed from these as well. Is this okay?
I think that's absolutely fine. You don't want to give milk. Milk is really bad for hedgehogs and things. So you can give cat food and dog food and biscuits. That's great. There's a bit of conflicting advice on this, is that some people say that fish-based cat foods and dog foods are bad for hedgehogs. I don't think there's actually been any research to back that up, but don't hold me on that. I think if in doubt, don't feed fish flavored things, but that is fine. And you know, people worry about attracting badgers to their garden because I think they're going to dig everything up. Badgers are just looking for food. If you give them some peanuts, they'll just eat the food and then they'll go away, you know, and go and find, or hopefully they'll hang around. But they shouldn't be digging things up. So yes. I've just seen a note, Susan, to everyone, that's not true, RE fish. Yeah, it's kind of I think it's a bit of a myth. And this is something that I stuck to for quite a long time, was not feeding fish-based cat food, but I think that has been debunked. So yes, I think probably cat food is better than no cat food. So yeah, I think what you're feeding is great. Try and avoid bread, try and avoid milk. Those sort of natural things are fine.
And a couple of questions regarding small ponds. Laura was wondering if you needed to bury the Belfast sink, and somebody else was asking, how deep does a small pond need to be?
So you absolutely don't have to bury it, as long as you provide access in and out. So you can have a little ramp going in there, and you will get frogs and things accessing the pond via the ramp quite easily. But then you'll also have to make sure, just like any pond at any level, that it can get out as well. So you can build, if it's a Belfast sink, I would, it's obviously very steep sides, and creating any sort of gradients can be very difficult. I would maybe put you could put a little ramp going down, or you could build up some stones at one side. And what you can do as well is you can just fill it sort of half full, so some of the stones are exposed as well. I will say that having too many stones exposed can be bad, because they can heat up, like the same that I mentioned about the help me out here, liner. I think for a pond, again, I'll send you this resource called Just Add Water, which will provide everything you need to build a pond. But 20 centimetres, I think, is a good depth. 20 to 30 centimetres will be adequate. So I think a Belfast sink, if you can fill it sort of 3/4 of the way full, I think that will be fine as a pond. The key thing that you want to do is just avoid it drying out completely, because that will just kill anything that's living in there.
And there's one last question, or actually two questions. One from Catherine. I live across a road from a small wood. If I try to attract wildlife to my garden, am I putting hedgehogs in danger, or will they be crossing the road anyway?
I'm pretty sure they'll be crossing the road anyway. And I would say that if they're coming to your garden from a pond, from a wood, it's because the wood isn't providing them with enough resources. If the wood is fine for them, they'll stay in the wood. So if they're leaving the wood, it means that the wood isn't providing them everything that they need, and they'll be leaving anyway. It's not like they're going to sniff out your peanuts and come to your garden. They're probably quite happy in the wood. So I wouldn't worry about that. And I think the benefit to other wildlife by doing wildlife friendly gardening is definitely worth doing. So I wouldn't let that put you off. Hedgehogs get run over. They will go out onto a road regardless, and it is very sad. And I don't really know how we're going to stop it, because it is a significant issue, and one of the major reasons why hedgehogs are declining in the UK. But don't let it put you off for those reasons. I just saw a quick question coming up. I just wanted to, somebody's just said, is now is it too late to build a pond? You can build a pond at any time of the year. So, if you're going to build a pond now or not build a pond at all, absolutely go for it. Your plants may not become very well established, and you won't get anything breeding in it this year because it's probably a bit too late, but it will then, maybe it'll have time to settle for next year when things may be coming in and breeding. So you can build a pond at any time of the year. It's not too late.
That was actually the last question I was going to ask.
Oh, sorry.
So there aren't any questions unless somebody wanted to do. Well,
we're pretty much out of time anyway, actually. So yeah, I was going to just say, is there one last question? But we've kind of dealt with that, so that's great. What there is a lot of really, really positive comments about how that was a great presentation, really helpful, and people have got some kind of practical ideas that they can pretty much straight away put into practice. So that's fantastic. And it was, thank you very much as well to everyone who contributed to the chat, because there was some really nice exchanges where people were kind of discussing things and answering each other's questions. So I do have to thank you once again, Sarah, for a really well presented session that it's attracted a really good audience. And it's just so kind of you to be following that up